And the story of 20 is the story of Abraham, and Abraham living in the south of Israel, which is a region called Gerar. And again, once again, just like we had in the beginning of the stories of Abraham, when Sarah was taken to Egypt, to the king of Egypt, and then saved, here we have almost a repeat of the same story. Maybe there's slight differences. There are some differences, maybe important differences, but it's the same idea that Abraham says he comes to a new region. He doesn't know what the moral standards of the town is. So he doesn't want to say that Sarah, who was exceptionally beautiful, is his wife. So she says, she's my sister. And the king takes Sarah, and God intervenes, comes to the king at night, and tells him that you're going to die because you took a married woman. Avimelech has the conversation with Abraham. He says, what did I do? How come you didn't tell me that she's your wife? And Abraham says, well, he justifies it. He says, I didn't know what the standards of the people here were. And eventually, the end of the story is Abraham prays for the benefit of the people of Avimelech and his household. And that's the end. And the king says, you can live wherever you want, and I'm going to protect you, etc. And that's the end of chapter 20. The big question is, okay, so beyond the information that we get from this story, so it's informational, telling us what happened in Abraham's life. The question is, what are the big themes? What are the ideas? How is this advancing the plot? What do we learn about Abraham himself? What are the big ideas that we can glean from this portion? So that's what we're going to try to do, in addition to just reading the simple interpretation and getting the straightforward interpretation. So we begin with Abraham coming to this region. So if you look at, if you have the stone Chumash, it's page 91, chapter 20, verse 1. I'll try to share the screen here. See if I can share the screen here. Okay, so this is chapter 20, right after the story of Sodom. So it's the story of the destruction of Sodom, the Sodom Valley. Try to make it a little bigger if I can. Okay. And Abraham traveled there to the land of the south, and he dwelt between Kadesh and between Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. So it tells us that Abraham moved. He goes southward. He was really living north of that on the mountains, but close to the valley, the Jordan, the valley of where the Dead Sea was, which is where Sodom was. And now he moves south, and it tells us where he lives. So he's between Kadesh and between Shur. That's where he dwelt. And then it says he lived, Vayagar Bigrar. He lived in Gerar. Translated here as sojourned. So sojourned means he lives in a temporary way. Vayagar. In modern Hebrew, when you say gar, where do you live? You say Efat gar. Where do you live? Gar. Gar isn't to live, even permanently. But in biblical Hebrew, the word gar comes from the word ger. Ger is a foreigner. In other words, you're living here not as a resident, but as a foreigner. This is not really your place. So that's the subtlety of the word. That's the subtlety of the word Vayagar. So now what's interesting here, the commentaries point out that it's actually interesting because we have two terms in this verse. If you look at this verse, same verse. So Abraham traveled from there to the land of the south, and he dwelt. And he dwelt, Vayeshev means to dwell, and dwell in a permanent way. So he dwells between Kadesh and between Shur, and he lived in a temporary way. He sojourned in Gerar. So what was his attitude? What is he? Did he dwell? Did he live there in a permanent way? Or was he just a sojourner? Or was he there in a temporary way? And it's the same verse. That's interesting. It's a subtlety. I would not pick it up on my own. I'll be honest with you. So that is the question that is raised. And one answer, so beautiful answer from Rabbi Shamshon Hirsch, and he says something that is very creative. He says, Abraham, if you look at the map, the Kadesh and Shur is really still the desert. So it's not the city. So Abraham sets up shop in a permanent way in the south but it's outside the city. It's more in the rural area. And then from time to time, he would actually move and go in to the town of Gerar. And that's why both terms are mentioned, and it's precise which term is used where. He dwelt, his permanent dwelling was between Kadesh and Shur, right? His permanent dwelling is in the desert, in other words, in the unsettled area. But occasionally he also he sojourns. He goes to Gerar on a temporary basis, and there the trouble begins with his wife, that he says that Sarah is not his wife, is his sister. So that's the point. That's the subtlety here. He dwells and he lives. In other words, he dwells and he sojourns. So what's the significance of this? So the first thing Rabbi Shamshon Fal Hirsch says is look, he says, Abraham is always careful, almost always, you see, he doesn't live in big cities. We know that all the patriarchs were shepherds, and they were outside of the city, and the city was seen as the sort of the source of society, and the values of society, which at that point were corrupt. So Abraham wants to maintain his own morality by placing himself out, by being outside the city. That you see consistent. There's another point that Abraham also tries to live in places where people travel, because that's where you get the most exposure. You could be living in a big city for 100 years, and you're living on your street, and nobody knows about you except for the people on your street. And there's no Twitter, and there's no Facebook. But if you want to place yourself in a strategic location, you place yourself on the highway, then anyone who matters, anyone who's important hears about you because they pass through your tent and you're going to feed them. So it's actually a strategic place. So Abraham consistently is always away from the town, outside of the town, living by himself, even though he's serving people that are traveling. However, says Rabbi Shamshon Fal Hirsch, it's important for him. Abraham now knows that he's going to have a child, because now the promise of God and the promise of the angel was in 1 year you're going to have a child. So what he says is that in order to raise a child, it's actually important not for the child not to be alone, but to also have exposure to other people. And that's why, even though he settles between Kadesh and Barad, that's where he is in a permanent fashion, but he sojourns in Gerar from time to time. He takes him to town. He takes him to the city. He sets up a shop. He has a house there that he goes there occasionally. Why? The first time we see it being done in this manner is before his child is born. So perhaps it's because that's what he's thinking about for his child. And why would you expose your child to a place like Gerar, which is corrupt? And that's why Abraham doesn't want to live there. So the argument he puts forth is that it's actually healthy for the child to see, in addition to seeing the morality of the parents' home, to actually see the contrast and see that not everybody lives the way my parents do and with the values that Abraham does. And actually that will allow them to appreciate the values of their parents. Contrast that if you keep them secluded between Kadesh and Barad forever, or until they grow up, then if they were never exposed early on to the other people, then actually there's more of a chance that they may be affected negatively because they don't have a system. They never understood that there are other people living differently, and they never understood the superiority of the ways of Abraham and Sarah. So it looks like Rabbi Shamshon Fal Hirsch is actually explaining the verse, but it looks like he's really giving practical parental advice, and it brings the metaphor of if you're going to seclude your child from all exposure to other people, then when you finally do expose them in the medical sense, when you finally do expose them, they're going to actually become vulnerable to illness because they don't have the immune system, because they were never exposed to any of the viruses or any of the bacteria. So if you really that's what he says. He says if you try to protect your child completely, you're actually weakening them. And just like you need a strong immune system, so you have to expose your child to other children, send them to preschool, even though they're going to come back with a runny nose, you also have to spiritually expose them. So it's like really, on one hand, he's separate, right? He's saying, I don't live in this region. I live between Kadesh and Bered, and that's where I am. Between Kadesh and Shur, that's where I am. That's my permanent space, my yeshiv, that's where he dwells. To dwell means to live permanently. I don't want to be part of that society, but I'm also interacting with that society. I'm exposed to that society. And like I said, Rabbi Shamshon Nefal here says, this is how you raise children. You give them a anchor of who we are, and we're not necessarily influenced by other people, but we also interact with other people. Somebody said, where did I hear this joke? Oh, I heard this joke the other night. Someone was his 96th birthday party, and they said, "Noop, what does it feel like to be 96?" And the person says, "Well, the good thing is there's a lot less peer pressure." So I guess at some point, I guess that it's related here somehow. I forgot how, but the idea here is that you want to really expose your child to peer pressure, because that allows the person to be able to learn how to understand and evaluate the value system that they want to live by, and they've been taught, and realize that other people are different, but that's okay. And you could actually appreciate what you have when you compare it to other things. So that is the first idea here of just placing the story of where Abraham is living. I forgot to say why he moved. Why did he move? Right? It says, "Vayisam Misham Avraham." The opening phrase of chapter 20. Avraham traveled from there. From where? From the region near Sodom. He wasn't living in Sodom, but he was living on the mountain, not too far. And he moves away from there. And then he settles, as we mentioned, he settles between Kadesh and Barak. So why does he move? So Rashi offers two interpretations. We'll start with the first, because when Rashi says two interpretations, the first one is the more straightforward one. Avram traveled from there. When he saw that the cities had been destroyed and the travelers had ceased to pass by, he migrated from there. Abraham's out of business, right? Abraham is in the hospitality business. And it's because the cities are destroyed, so there's no more commerce. People are not coming to that region. So Abraham says, "I'm out of town." And that's why he moved. That's the first interpretation. Second interpretation is to distance himself from Lot, who had acquired a bad reputation because he had been intimate with his daughters. From Genesis Rabbah, the Medrash brings both interpretations. We'll stick with the first one if you want, or if you want, you can take the second one. The bottom line is Abraham moves because it's inconsistent with his mission. His mission is to spread the teaching, the oneness of Hashem through his hospitality, his treating of other people with kindness. And he's out of business because no one's traveling in the region anymore. So he moves south. And like I said, he places himself outside the town, but also still related close to the town. And sometimes he sojourns into the city of Gerar. Okay, fine. Now we get to verse 2. Verse 2 reads, Rashi. Verse 2 reads, "And Abraham said about his wife, she is my sister. And Avimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And God came to Avimelech in a dream at night, and he said to him, Behold, you are going to die because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a married woman. And Avimelech had not come near to her. And he said, O Lord, will you kill even a righteous nation?" Right? It's similar to what Abraham tells God before Sodom. Are you going to kill the righteous with the wicked? So he says, "Are you going to kill me? I'm righteous. Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she said, he is my brother. With the innocence of my heart and with the purity of my hands have I done this." And God said to him in a dream, "I too know that you did this with the innocence of your heart. And I too have withheld you from sinning to me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. And now return this man's wife, because he is a prophet, and he will pray for you and you will live. But if you do not return her, know that you will surely die, and all that is yours." Avimelech arose early in the morning, and he summoned all his servants, and he spoke to these words in their ears, and the men were very frightened. Okay, fine. We'll stop over here. We'll continue in a minute. So what's happening here? First of all, you read these verses, you become very let's read a little bit more. You become very sympathetic to Avimelech. What did he do wrong? He steps in. He takes Sarah because Sarah was not married. She was his sister. So we'll continue reading and read what Abraham responds. He approaches Abraham. Verse 9, "And Avimelech summoned Abraham and said to him, What have you done to us? And what have I sinned against you, that you have brought upon me and upon my kingdom a great sin? These that are not done, you have done to me." And Avimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" In other words, why did you put me in this position, morally compromising position, the fact that you said she's your sister? And Abraham said, "For I said, surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." And also, indeed, she is my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. She is his sister. Sister in biblical terminology could also mean niece, brother. In biblical Hebrew, when you say child, it could be a grandchild. When you say sister, it could mean the daughter of my brother, sibling. So he says, she is my sister, technically. And it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said to her, this is your kindness which you shall do with me. Whither we come, say about me, he is my brother. In other words, this is our pattern. Wherever we go for protection, wherever we go, we say, I told her to say, this is my brother. And Avimelech took flocks and cattle and men servants and maidservants, and he gave them to Abraham, and he restored to him his wife Sarah. And Avimelech said, here is my land before you, wherever it pleases you, you may dwell. And to Sarah he said, behold, I have given 1,000 pieces of silver to your brother. Behold, it is to you as a covering of the eyes for all who are with you, and with all you shall contend. I gave you a lot of money, 1,000 pieces of silver. It will be a covering of eyes for anyone who you will contend with. What does that mean? So Rashi explains, people shouldn't think, well, he just abducted her and then sent her empty-handed. No, he gives her gifts. So that represents the fact that he was not able to take her without her permission. And that's what represented with the money he gives. So we'll keep reading and then we'll go back. We have 2 more verses to finish the chapter. And Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Avimelech and his wife and his handmaids, and they gave birth. For the Lord has shut every womb of Avimelech's household because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So it turns out that Abraham prays for Avimelech and his household, and they gave birth. What does it mean they gave birth? So Rashi explains that the illness that God strikes Avimelech and his family is that they can't. All openings were closed. They couldn't use the bathroom. Everything was there was no letting anything out. And when he says give birth, means everything opens up. And that's a traditional interpretation. And that's it. That's the end of the story. So it really doesn't. We're not necessarily sure what exactly the story is teaching us, besides being the information of what happens. But there are commentaries who try to give the big picture. Just one. I'm just going to start at the end, and I'm going to skip to the next chapter. And the next chapter is Sarah giving birth. Where are we?
Question.
Yes.
It's interesting. If you read the text, he says that she's my sister.
Yes.
But that doesn't explicitly mean that she's not married, perhaps, to somebody else.
Right. So we're gonna get into this question and see. When you read the verses, it sounds like you become very sympathetic to Avimelech. And Steve is saying, if you look carefully, well, maybe Abraham is giving the other side of the coin. When you speak to a king, you can't be that explicit. So maybe we're going to look carefully and see what Abraham says and also what God says. And we want to really figure out who is in the right over here and what the profile of Avimelech is. And there's different forms of immorality in Egypt, where Sarah was taken to, and where Avimelech lives. And therefore that colors the way they talk about this. So we have to get into that. But before we do that, just sort of the big picture, what's this portion doing here? So I mentioned we're going to do one more verse at the beginning of chapter 22. We're going to go to chapter 21. And right after the story, it says that Sarah gives birth. And the Lord remembered Sarah, and as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had spoken. And the next verse it says, and Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham. Okay. What's the problem with this verse? Verse 1. Verse 1, the problem is the word and. And. What's and? Most times a new chapter doesn't begin with and. And means it's a continuation. It's a vav hachibur, a vav that connects. We had it in yesterday's parsha, ve'ela hamishpatim, and these are the commandments. And Rashi talks about the connection between the mishpatim, the civil law, and the 10 Commandments. But it's very unusual for a chapter to start with and. It's not just a chapter, and the chapters weren't divided from a Jewish source, but even in the Torah scroll, you have a new parsha. Parsha means a new portion. There's a break in the text, and it starts and, which is not very usual. But it's interesting. From here till the next few portions are all connected some form or another, but here it's unusual. Here it's unusual. So Rashi explains, and the Lord remembered Sarah, quotes the Talmud. This section was placed next to the preceding section to teach you that whoever begs for mercy for his friend, when he needs the same thing, he is answered first. For it is said, verse 17, and Abraham prayed, etc., and immediately following it, and it says, and the Lord remembered Sarah, i.e., he had already remembered her before he healed Avimelech. So what Rashi is telling us, quoting the Talmud, is that the connection that you see that the Torah emphasizes, that God answering Sarah is above, it's a continuation to the previous story, is because at the end of the previous story, Abraham prays for Avimelech and his household. And like we mentioned, the verse uses the description to give birth, even though it's not technically giving birth, but that's what the verse says. The verse says that God cured them and they gave birth, right? That was the verse. For the Lord has shut every womb of Avimelech's household because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And a little before that, verse 17, and Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Avimelech and his wife and his handmaids, and they gave birth. So here Abraham is praying for Avimelech and his household, and the result is that Sarah is healed. Sarah also gives birth. So that's the connection according to the sages. There are other connections, but that's when we start with, because that's what Rashi mentions. Now we're going to take Neil's question, but then after that we'll go back and we'll try to examine this more closely. What did Abraham do? What did Avimelech claim? He claims to be innocent. He claims to be moral. Is he right? Is he wrong? Does God agree with Avimelech? Does God disagree with Avimelech? So we have a lot of analyzing to do. Go ahead, Neil. Oh, we can't hear you.
What's the difference between pakad and zocher in chapter 21, verse 1?
Okay, you're jumping you're jumping ahead. Hashem pakad and zachar. This could be a good joke. I would say I don't remember, because two terms of memory. I don't remember. I do remember that I have it written down, and I'm going to check it in a second. But right, what's the guy said? What's the difference between ignorance and apathy? So he has asked, what's the difference in ignorance and apathy? He says, I don't know and I don't care. So I think I could check it out, right? Fine word. Fine.
You don't have to answer right now. Just
no, here, sitting right here. Hashem pakad. Assuming my phone works, which is a big assumption. Pakad. Okay, I'll get back to you. Go ahead, Bob.
Good morning, Rabbi. Just to follow up on what you said, it doesn't only seem that we are more sympathetic to Abimelech. It almost seems like, hey, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I mean, this is the second time that Abraham is committing a lie. Right. And furthermore, it seems in God coming to a dream to Abimelech that he has kind of a relationship with a non-Jew, and that, in a way that Abimelech could be a prophet. Right.
That's a very big difference between this story and the story of when Sarah was taken to Pharaoh. When Sarah was taken to Pharaoh, so Pharaoh is struck with a plague, but God is not going to speak to Pharaoh. And here, God speaks to Avimelech. So that's like one of the most important differences that just sort of jump out right at you. Avimelech here is this guy, God is talking to him. And you could say, well, God is talking to him, not because he's so great, because it's about Sarah. So really the important character here is Sarah. You could say that, but God doesn't speak to Pharaoh, even when it's regarding Sarah. He just punishes the Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh figures out that he's doing something wrong. So a lot of people say that's the big difference. And maybe that's telling us that the people living in Egypt are far more corrupt than the people living in Israel, because Gerar is still part of biblical Israel, because we know that from in the future where God tells Isaac, don't leave Israel, and Isaac settles in Gerar. So we'll get to that. That could be a very important part here. In other words, that just because they both take Sarah, maybe that's the way the Torah emphasizes that it's not the same story. It's a different story. It's a more refined form of the previous story. And the fact that God is speaking to him is an indication of his moral superiority, certainly over the king of Egypt. Now, we still have to understand and figure out what is Abraham. When you mentioned that Abraham did it twice, so was it a good idea what he said? Was it a bad idea? Was this king totally moral? Was he not as innocent as he makes himself sound? All this, hopefully, we'll discuss in the next few minutes. But thank you for raising that point because that's important. Go ahead, Dr. Ken.
Forgive me for my ignorance, but why did he have to lie about his marital relationship with Sarah?
Because he says that he says it here as well later in the verses as well. This is what I told her when we left our father's home. But you really you get more information earlier in the story. She was a beautiful woman, and the custom would be that if you are married, then if they want to abduct you, they're just basically going to kill your husband, because it's just easier that way. If you're not married, then there's a path forward. Then they'll basically negotiate with your family and say, oh, do we want to marry you? How much does it cost? How much do we have to pay you? How much do we have to bribe you? And that's a process. And in the process, nobody's going to get killed. And if you know how to negotiate, you probably can actually avoid the marriage to begin with. Because in other words, at some point, you could just, if you realize that they're really interested in you, you could pick up and leave. So that was the plan when they come to the first time this happened, when they come to Egypt. Abraham says, look, if you say you're my wife, they're going to kill me. If you say you are my sister, then they'll let me live and they'll send me gifts. So the commentaries explain, what does it mean he gifts? He wants gifts. That's what he's looking for. He's going to put his wife in danger because he wants gifts. So the commentaries explain, no, what it means is that they're going to send me gifts to be on my good side, and maybe eventually I will agree to the marriage. So that could take a few months or a few years. By the time then we pack our bags and we go back to Israel. The reason why that plan failed is because the king stepped in. They brought her to the king. The king found out about her, and the ministers took her to the king, and that was the end of that. So Abraham's plan didn't work. But the fear seems to be legitimate because look over here, she was taken to Pharaoh. She's taken to Avimelech. So the sages say that she was a beautiful woman, and everybody wanted to take her. So that's what he does for defense. Now he lies. So the simple one way to read it, he's just lying to protect himself, and he doesn't really care what happens to Sarah. But the commentators, as we mentioned, explain, no, if she says she's my sister, then actually Sarah can also be protected, at least to a degree, even though when the king steps in, it doesn't help. But we don't necessarily know that he was trying to protect himself against the king. He was probably trying to protect himself against the common people, both in Egypt and here. But that didn't really work out completely.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I see in my notes here, Pakad and Amar. So the Hasidic interpretation says, Pakad and Amar, Pakad is Hashem remembered Sarah, as he said, and he did as he promised. So we had God remembered and God did. These are the two terms. So the Hasidic interpretation is that before you have the actual action in this world, you have to have the spiritual empowerment. So Pakad, God remembering, represents the spiritual blessing that God gives her. And God did represents the actual blessing in this world. So that's the two stages. When before the blessing comes in the physical form, it comes in the form of spiritual empowerment, and that's step one. So that's what is written down in my notes. We have to look more and see if there's anything else to add. Okay. Okay, now the fun begins. So, whoops. That's the wrong. Okay, fun begins. We're going to read chapter, what are we? Chapter 20, and we're going to read. We want to focus on verse 4 and 5. So, God comes in verse 3, God comes to Avimelech, and God came to Avimelech in a dream at night, and he said to him, "Behold, you are going to die because of the woman who you have taken, for she is a married woman." Avimelech had not come near to her, and he said, "O Lord, would you kill even a righteous nation?" Problem with the king is he thinks the king is the nation, right? So he says, he killed me, I'm the nation, right? So he says, are you going to kill a righteous nation? And he says, and then he redefends himself. So let's see how he defends himself, and let's see if God accepts his defense. So it becomes very interesting. You have to read this very subtly. Okay. Verse 5, Abimelech says, "Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she said, he is my brother? With the innocence of my heart and with the purity of my hands, I have done this." That's his defense. The innocence of my heart and the purity of my hands, I have done this. It's two stages. Innocence of my heart, purity of my hands, two different statements. Now, let's see if God accepts his the way he portrays himself. And God said to him in a dream, "I too know that you did this with the innocence of your heart." Oh, very good. He says, "I did this with the innocence of my heart." And God says, "I also know that you did this with the innocence of my heart." So far, he's on the same page. God agrees with him. "And I too have withheld you from sinning to me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her." Okay. So we know the first thing he says, God agrees. God says, he says, "With the innocence of my heart and with the purity of my hands, I have done this." With the innocence of my heart is innocent. That's what he says. What does God respond? God says, "Yes, I do know that you did this with the innocence of your heart." Okay. So that seems like God agrees with him. But the problem is the fact that God agrees with him with the first half actually highlights that God does not accept what he says in the second half, right? The second half, he says in verse 5, he says, "With the innocence of my heart and with the purity of my hands," which means I did nothing wrong. Innocence of the heart is intention. I had no bad intention. Okay, fine. God says yes. But then he says, "And with the purity of my hands, have I done this? I did nothing wrong." And here God doesn't necessarily agree. God says, I too have withheld you from sinning to me. You did nothing wrong because I did not allow you to do anything wrong. But in other words, it seems that God is not accepting the premise that I did nothing wrong. Yes, you had no negative intention, but that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. So that's the two things that he presents, and God sort of agrees to one of them. And the question is, becomes, what is the big picture? What does this really tell us about morality in general? So one interpretation, go ahead.
So by preventing him, doesn't that negate the free choice?
Yes, God is not giving him complete free choice because God is intervening to protect Sarah. So sometimes free choice is, sometimes God steps in for a reason. Okay, so he says, "I had no evil intention." Does God agree? Yes, God agrees. Did I do anything wrong? I didn't do anything wrong. God doesn't necessarily agree. Why not? So there are different opinions, different theories. So one opinion is, you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't have an evil intention because you didn't know. But does that really take you off the hook? What about should you have known? Should you have investigated? Right? So that's really a deeper question. The deeper question is, I didn't know anything wrong. What is ignorance a defense? What do they say? Is ignorance is not a defense for the law, something like that. not knowing, you had no intention, that's correct, but you didn't do anything wrong, not necessarily. You should have investigated, you should have thought about this, and you should have investigated and found out. And in that sense, it seems like God is saying you did not do enough to know. You were very happy not to know. In other words, if you're the king, you really have to think about, why is somebody saying she's my sister? Is that really true? Don't take it face value. You have to investigate and look a little deeper. That's one interpretation, which I want to get into that in a second. But another interpretation is, okay, you had no evil intention, but you did something wrong. You took the woman without permission. Okay, so you had no evil intention, which is no intention to be with a married woman, but it doesn't mean your hands are clean. Your hands aren't necessarily clean. So that is the two problems with what he does. First of all, maybe he doesn't do the terrible sin of taking a married woman, but he takes a woman without a permission. That is a problem. So God does not agree that he has clean hands. But another point is, he says, I didn't know. My heart was innocent. God would say, God is maybe saying, the fact that you didn't know is not enough, because the fact that you didn't know is because maybe you didn't want to know. Why is this so interesting? Because later in the story, after Isaac is born, later on in the story, you see Avimelech makes a treaty with Abraham. So it's just one, it's the next, it's probably connected. It's really the next, it's the next chapter. So I want to take a peek at the next chapter, and we'll see what happens in the next chapter, and we'll see if we can detect a pattern in the behavior of this guy who claims to be Avimelech, who claims to be completely innocent. So this is sort of the end of chapter 21. Verse 22, now it came to pass, whoops, I have to share the screen. So if you're looking at the Stone edition of the Chumash, it's page 99 and verse 22. Okay, so I'll read a few verses and we'll see what happens here. Verse 22. Now it came to pass at that time that Avimelech and Pichol his general said to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. And now swear to me here by God that you will not lie to me or to my son or to my grandson. According to the kindness that I have done with you, you shall do with me and with the land wherein you have sojourned. In other words, let's make a deal, not a treaty, not just between ourselves, but also between our children and grandchildren. And Abraham said, I will swear. Okay, we'll make a treaty. And Abraham contended with Avimelech about the well of water that the servants of Avimelech had forcibly seized. So Abraham, the most valuable asset in the outskirts of Gerar, which is really desert land, is water. So Abraham has a well, and Avimelech's servants forcibly seized Abraham's well. Okay, you ready for Avimelech's response? Okay. And Avimelech said, I do not know who did this thing. Neither did you tell me, nor did I hear of it until today. I had no idea. That's his defense. Okay. Now, is that a moral defense? Your people, your servants, steal somebody's well, and you don't know. Okay. You don't know. You can't be held accountable for not knowing. But maybe you could. Maybe the problem is that you don't know. Maybe the fact that you don't investigate what your people are doing is part of the problem. And maybe we see the same defense in both places. And maybe we detect a pattern. He doesn't know. He'd rather not know. I don't want to know if she's your wife, and I don't want to know that my people took your water. And maybe that's his. That's the way he operates. In other words, he understands the concept of morality, but he feels that if he doesn't investigate, he doesn't know. He doesn't have to worry about the choices that are less than moral choices that the people around him are making. And maybe God is saying, you have an innocent heart. Meaning to say you didn't intentionally do something wrong, but God does not agree. God doesn't agree with his full statement where he says, I have an innocent heart and clean hands. He says you have no clean hands. You didn't know, but maybe you should have known. And the reason why I like this interpretation is because you see the same person one chapter over giving the same defense to taking a well from Abraham. Now, Abraham is a famous citizen, and if it was well in the desert, everybody knows about it, right? This is probably, people hear about this news, the news travels, but the king doesn't want to know. If he doesn't want to know, he doesn't have to worry about the choices that are less than moral. And maybe God is telling him that is not the definition of morality. If you don't know, but you should have known, then that's a problem. So you have to really ask yourself, why is Abraham saying, she says she's my sister, but why is she saying this? Maybe there's a reason why they're saying why you're saying this. Maybe the conversation which he has with Abraham the next day, maybe he should have had it the day before. So maybe that's really what the Torah is teaching us. In other words, you have a model. Avimelech is clearly not the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh doesn't care for morality whatsoever. But now we have a model of somebody else who does understand the concept of morality, but would prefer to be ignorant. And if I feel that if I'm ignorant of what's going on around me, then I don't have any moral culpability. And maybe the Torah is telling us, and maybe God is telling him, no, that is not that just because you don't know, but if you should have known and you should have investigated, then you do not have clean hands. So it's clear that the Torah is painting Avimelech different than the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. But here is another model of a less coarse form of immorality. But it's also important to understand that God does not accept this defense, and the defense that I didn't know, and therefore I have clean hands. No, you didn't know. You're right. So it's not a terrible sin like Egypt, but you didn't have clean hands. And it's just interesting, and I think that it's beautiful to see that Abraham, it's not a mistake that Avimelech in the next story also, the king doesn't know. Kings know what's going on. They have Secret Service, they have the NSA, they listen to our phone conversations, they know what's going on, but this guy doesn't know. The one thing he's coming to make a treaty with the guy, but he doesn't know that yesterday his people took away his well. Of course he doesn't know. He doesn't know because he doesn't want to know. Assuming he doesn't know. Maybe he does know and he's saying he doesn't know. Maybe he's lying. But you don't even have to say he's lying. The fact that he doesn't know is maybe itself the problem. And maybe that's what the Torah is highlighting. So that's one way to look at it. That's Avimelech's side. Does God agree with Avimelech? Now we have to look at Abraham and say, what did Abraham do and why did Abraham say what he said? So we have to examine Abraham's part of the conversation. But you see in the chapter, that happens later. The first thing is the conversation between God and Avimelech. And Avimelech says, I did nothing wrong. I have a clean heart and I have an innocent heart and clean hands. And God says, yes, you have an innocent heart. Now you have to read between the lines. And God is saying, yeah, but you don't have clean hands, right? Rashi already points that out. But this connection with the person who says, I don't know, as a defense, that's a little bit more modern than Rashi. But the idea that reading the verse immediately, you see that God, by the fact that God agrees with part of his statements, it highlights the fact that God does not agree with the full statement. And now, if anybody wants to comment, please comment. Otherwise, we go to look at Abraham's angle. Why does Abraham say something, put forth this solution, if, as Bob said, he tried it once, wasn't actually perfect, it didn't really work the first time around, why does he try this again? Okay, so let's look back at, let's continue looking at the verses here. We want to see at the conversation between Abraham, between God and between Avimelech and Abraham. Avimelech and Abraham. Okay, here we go. And Avimelech summoned Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And what have I sinned against you, that you have brought upon me and upon my kingdom a great sin? Deeds that are not done, you have done to me. And Avimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? Why are you lying? Why are you telling everybody that she's your sister? Which is going to cause a potential for a sin. Now, by the way, the commentaries explain. I'm bringing in this, even though it's written later, because I want to sort of support Avimelech's claim. The commentaries explain that there's a big difference between Egypt and Avimelech. If you look later in the chapter, Avimelech tells Abraham and Sarah in verse 15, and Avimelech said, here is my land before you. Wherever it pleases you, you may dwell. He says, you could live wherever you want in my region. Contrast this with the story of Sarah been taken to Egypt. And there, the verse says, if you look at, I'm not going to find it on the screen, take too much time, but 59, in the Stone edition is 59. Again, after Pharaoh is struck because of taking Sarah, Pharaoh realizes that she's really Abraham's wife. So verse 18, Pharaoh summoned Abraham and said, page 59, Pharaoh summoned Abraham and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she is your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I will take her as my wife? Now, here is your wife, take her and go. So Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they escorted him and his wife, all that was his. Pharaoh says, check out of town. He says, now that I realize what happened here, take your wife and go. Not only go, but he actually sends the security to escort him back to Israel. Okay, why is it that Pharaoh is sending him away, and Avimelech says, you could live wherever you want? So the commentaries explain, Pharaoh knows that the people in his land are corrupt, and therefore Sarah, the beautiful woman, is vulnerable wherever she is in the land of Egypt. So he knows that there are holy people, and if you take them, it will bring harm onto Egypt. So Pharaoh says, get out of here because it's not safe for you, because all the people are immoral. When it comes to Avimelech, Rashi explains that no, Avimelech says you could live wherever you want because no one's going to harm you. If you say that she is your wife, nobody's going to bother you. And that's why he says you could live wherever you want. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this so that it shows that Avimelech seems to be living in a society that does have moral norms. And therefore, you ask the question, why does Abraham have to say this, that she's my sister, accusing the people of being immoral if they were not as certainly not as immoral as the Egyptians. So that is sort of a support for Avimelech, for Avimelech's claim against Abraham. Now, what does Abraham say? You have to defend Abraham too. So what does Abraham say? And Abraham said, for I said, surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And also, indeed, she is my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. Verse 13, and it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said to her, this is the kindness which you shall do to me. Wherever we come, say about me, he is my brother. Okay, let's start with the second one. The second one is easier. The second one, he says, look, it's nothing personal, right? Abraham tells Avimelech, it's not a judgment against you or your people. This is just a pattern. Wherever I go, that's what I say. That's what we say. So in other words, we don't really know the moral standards of every place we get to. We can't read about it in the paper. So that's what we do. Wherever we go, we say she is my sister or he is my brother, and that's what we do everywhere. So it's nothing personal. Why does Abraham do this? Because he comes to the unknown. And if he comes to the unknown, he doesn't know, he has to protect himself. That's the defense for Abraham. So that's verse 13. But verse 11 is also very interesting. He says, and Abraham said, for I said, surely, rak, only, ein yirat Elokim, there's no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. So what's the conversation here? Avimelech is portraying his nation as a nation, or his culture as a culture that has moral norms. And he says, why did you do this to us, right? This is not done. In other words, you had nothing to fear. And Abraham says, there's no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. What's Abraham saying? You could read this in saying, Abraham says, I didn't know. I thought there's no fear of God in this place, but I was wrong. What is Abraham saying? I thought there was no fear of God in this place, and they'll kill me because of my wife. And now what do I know? So you could say Abraham was also, he says, I didn't know. So that's what I did. But other people want to read this and they say like this. Of course, you have a moral society. The problem with your moral society is it's not based on the fear of God. And if you have a moral system that is not based on a higher power, ultimately it will not stand the test of and protect against immorality. And therefore what Abraham is really telling Avimelech is you can't have a system of morality that is not based on the fear of God. And therefore he says, I knew there's no fear of God here because yes, it was a moral society, but it wasn't based on a higher power. And therefore a person ultimately is vulnerable because if the morality is not based on a higher power, it could fall away when a person has a reason to, when a person wants to do away with it. And that relates, I'm only saying this, and I'm not only saying this, but this also relates to yesterday's parsha. Yesterday's parsha, we said, is mishpatim, is the law, the civil law, which is connected to the Ten Commandments, the continuation of the Ten Commandments. So there's a big discussion. The commentaries explain the civil law has to come from Sinai. Civil law has to be based on the divine revelation, has to be based on a higher power. And even in the Ten Commandments themselves, right? What are the Ten Commandments? You have mitzvot that are logical: don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. But it's also, why do you need that in Ten Commandments? Why can't people figure that out on their own? So some commentators explain, because if you have a system of morality that's not based on a higher power, ultimately the system of morality will fail. And that's why even the do not kill is premised on the Lord your God. And it seems like Abraham is tapping into this notion. Abraham is telling Avimelech, it's not, you can't really have a moral society if there's no fear of God in this place. And therefore he says that justifies his Abraham's fear. So that's a little bit about the conversation between Abraham and Avimelech and God and Avimelech. And it seems that this story is certainly an advancement of the story of in the previous parsha, the parsha of Lech Lecha, when Sarah was taken to Egypt, because Egypt was a clearly immoral society. And now this parsha is teaching us, I think, to understand and appreciate that there are societies that it's a little bit more complex. They do have a commitment to morality, but it's not ultimately, they're not completely innocent. And Avimelech was the example where somebody chooses to look the other way and not be knowledgeable about the moral problems and hope that means that if I don't know about it, that means I'm not guilty, but maybe it's immoral not to know. And the deeper point here is also the conversation between Avimelech and Abraham. And what Abraham teaches him is, if you really want to have a moral society where strangers can show up and not be afraid, then your system of values has to be based on a higher power. Ultimately, if not, ultimately the outsider is vulnerable. So that's what I think are some of the big ideas within this chapter, and how this chapter helps us explain how Abraham is teaching and continuing to teach morality wherever he shows up.
Rabbi, what's interesting is the gradations of morality over the last few chapters. We have Sodom at one moral level. We have Pharaoh in Egypt at one other moral level. And then here we see a gradation of slightly higher morality, but flawed nevertheless.
Right. And so it's interesting that Avimelech is someone that Abraham wants to influence. Avimelech is not somebody that is a foe. Avimelech, in the next chapter, as you mentioned, Avimelech makes a treaty with Abraham, and Abraham agrees to go to this treaty, but it's even a 4-generational treaty, which is not so simple. We'll get to it there. The commentaries ask why he made the treaty. Some Midrashim say it was a mistake, because that allows for, it's his land, and some people say it actually caused the delay of the Jewish people entering the land of Israel. The bottom line is, what is clear is Abraham is trying to influence his Avimelech. And the same story as you see with Yitzchak, Isaac too also ends up in Gerar and negotiates with Avimelech. It's either the same person or his successor, which also carries the name Avimelech, which is the name of the king. But the bottom line is here, you see how Abraham wants to interact with these people and influence them, and perhaps part of the idea that they do have a higher moral standard may be influenced by the fact that they're living in the region where Abraham's ideas are taking root, right? This is at least probably 24 and a half years, right? Because Abraham's not Isaac is not born yet. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Abraham has been in Israel since 75. So there's a quarter of a century of Abraham preaching in that region. So perhaps that makes all the difference, and that has the effect. So that's really the story in short on chapter 21. That was chapter 20. Next week is chapter 1, which starts very happy. It starts with the birth of Isaac. And after that, it starts getting complicated because we read about the challenge with Yishmael and how Abraham has to send away Yishmael, and very difficult paragraph to read. Then we have, and then we get to maybe even more difficult than that is chapter 22, is the binding of Isaac. So we have a lot to do in the next couple of weeks. So hopefully we'll meet up in good health. Have a wonderful day. We're finishing 2 minutes early so you can enjoy the sunny day today. And that we should meet each other in good health. Amen.